Today, we're going to watch the film Pride from 2014 and talk about how historically accurate it is to the real-life Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners group. So Pride tells the story of the 1984-1985 miners' strike and a group of miners in South Wales who were supported by a lesbian and gay fundraising group in London. So it's a tale of solidarity, of people from different communities putting aside their differences and coming together to fight a bigger cause, which in this case is Margaret Thatcher. I would like to reiterate something I said about The Muppet Christmas Carol. Just because a movie is historically accurate does not make it good. We can all think of movies that are extremely accurate and very boring, and we can all think of movies that are incredibly inaccurate and really fun. So if the film doesn't portray something 100% accurately, that's not because the film is bad. We're just using the film as an excuse to talk about LGSM, which is what the point of the film is, really. Something that's quite tricky about sort of talking about the historical accuracy of the film Pride is that a lot of people who the movie is based on are still around. Mike Jackson's still around, Sean James is still around, and they were advising on the movie. They went onto set, they talked to the scriptwriter. So I can often never definitively say that didn't happen because I haven't talked to these people. The scriptwriter talked to these people and maybe they said something that I haven't heard about. So I'm rarely going to be able to say that definitely didn't happen, but sometimes we can talk about things that happen slightly differently to how they're shown in the film. Alrighty, let's go! Play button doesn't work. Is it the batteries? Oh, I can't get the batteries out though. If I hadn't cut my nails, I could do this. Oh, they come out. Oh, thank God. One down. Oh. All right. Alrighty, let's try it again.
What force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong.
Okay, so we got some real-life clips of the 1980s miners' strike there, so a little bit of context. My understanding of the 1984 miners' strike is that in the 1970s there'd been a big miners' strike. The miners' union were the most powerful union in the country, and it had brought down the Tory government because nobody had coal, nobody could heat anything, there was rolling blackouts, and so, yeah, the government had come down. And in 1979, Margaret Thatcher becomes the Conservative Prime Minister and she's out for revenge. So she starts closing pits, and this time she's ready for miners' strikes. She'd built up a big supply of backup coal so that she could outlast the miners. And her idea was that she was going to break their power. So that's what's happening in 1984. The miners have realised her tactics. They're on strike. And Margaret Thatcher is bringing the full force of her coal stockpile and the police against them.
In 10 years, and you can say in 1984, I was proud and privileged to be a party to the greatest struggle on earth.
That's Arthur Scargill. He was the head of the miners' union.
Grab hold of this, will you, mate?
So Mike Jackson was the secretary for LGSM, and he's still around and still giving interviews. So a lot of what we know about LGSM comes from him.
It's just that I don't really want to be too visible. Was it your first Pride? Yeah, first anything.
I'm pretty sure that's Scotland Yard, which leads onto Whitehall. I think that might be where they filmed that.
Alright, so whether they're buckets?
Surprised you have to ask that question, Mike, coming from Accrington.
This is Stephanie Chambers. She was one of the more prominent lesbians in LGSM.
Where exactly have you been?
I want everyone to take a bucket and start rattling. This is for the miners.
So this is pretty accurate. I think Mark Ashton came up with the idea like a week before the 1984 Pride, but the 1984 Pride was the first time they were collecting money. So we do see a bit of police presence there. I suspect it would be significantly more than that in 1984. From accounts I've read of the time, they talk about the police being like 2 rows deep. This is a small budget film. They're not going to be able to hire that many extras and fit them all out in 1980s police uniforms. But from what I understand, it was significantly more militarised. All right, that's Gay's the Word in Bloomsbury. So that is a real queer bookshop that is still going, and a lot of the LGSM meetings were held there. They actually have a plaque there now to remember Mark Ashton. Private house parties were a really big part of the gay scene in London in the 1980s, partly because gay bars and clubs got raided a lot, and partly because part of the law about legal homosexual activity was that it had to be in private. Now, the law would not usually interpret this as private enough for homosexual activity, but having it in a house is part of it, rather than in a club.
I'm 20.
Won't go spreading that around. You're illegal, darling. 16 for the breeders, 21 for the gays.
That's true. Although homosexual sex between men was legalised in the 1960s, the age of consent was higher.
What they need is cash. And they need it urgently.
Yeah, because the miners have always come to our aid, haven't they?
Why don't we talk about today?
Today, with only a couple of buckets, we raised nearly 200 quid. Right, think what we could achieve if we really started trying.
I'm from Durham.
Well, you know exactly what we're talking about then.
I know those bastards kick the shit out of me every morning on my way to school. And every night on my way home.
This is a real thing that LGSM had to deal with. Gay people from mining towns saying we should not support these people, they wouldn't support us. Ray Goodspeed says that we found that people who came from this background were split pretty much 50-50 between those who would willingly give 20 quid and those who said, I came from a pit village or town, I hate those homophobic bastards, they made my life a misery, I ran away from London to get away from them, and they can die, they can rot in hell, come on Margaret Thatcher.
And what about me and Jonathan? Or is it exclusively for the under 25s?
So that's Gethin Roberts and Jonathan Blake, who are, again, both still around and both still giving interviews about LGSM.
Mark, face it.
They're on strike. They're busy.
They don't want to take our money because we're puffs.
And a date.
They'd rather starve.
Maybe we should just hand the money over anonymously. I mean, we don't have to say we're gay, do we?
No.
From what people in the LGSM say in interviews, it does seem like they were a bit worried about sending money directly to the miners' union because they'd had money seized recently by the government or they'd been fined. And also the miners' union were seen as potentially homophobic. Gethin Roberts says, I think it's true to say that the NUM was hostile to gay issues. Homosexuality was seen as unmanly.
Someone needs to go with him. First rule of the group.
I'll go.
Thank you, Steph.
That was a common rule in 1980s gay activist groups. No one collects alone because of queer bashing.
Let's get this right. So we are going to pick a mining town completely at random and just ring it. Is that the plan, is it, Mark?
Yeah, the town hall, the council.
Well, it's as easy as that.
Why not? Bypass the union altogether.
I think it's inspired.
So do I.
So they do bypass the union in going straight to the local support group, but they don't pick it at random. I think one of them knew somebody from South Wales, and that's how the connection was made. This is from Ray Goodspeed. One of the people who attended the LGSM meeting was a Communist Party member, and he knew Howell Francis, who had also been in the Communist Party and was part of the South Wales support group. So that's how they knew each other.
Guy Donovan, from the Delice Valley. You must be Mark.
Yes, hello?
LGSM. What does that stand for, then?
So this is Di Donovan. He really is the person who went down there first to London to meet LGSM.
I'm not going to pretend I'm not surprised. You could see that. Truth told, you're the first gays I've ever met in my life.
As far as you're aware.
That's true.
And you're the first miner I've ever met.
So this is how Di Donovan talks about that first meeting. One day, Howell said to me, when you're next in London, there's a cheque to be picked up from this group of gay people. At that point, gay rights hadn't crossed my path. Not personally. But I didn't think anything much about it. I just said I'd pick up the cheque, because there was no difference in my mind between them and any other group that supported us. So I arranged to meet Mark Ashton and Mike Jackson for a coffee in a wimpy bar just across the road from Paddington Station. We spent about an hour and a half or so chatting, and only spoke about the strike and about politics. And what was remarkable was the degree of synergy between my thoughts and the LGSM people I met.
Yeah.
What we, Mark?
Something I forgot to say when Mike Jackson was introduced earlier. He really does wear that hat in a lot of the photos of him from the 80s.
Trust me now, if you can handle this, it's going to make a huge difference.
What's he going to do? Take his clothes off?
I'm just going to say thank you.
Well, don't blame me if you get bottled.
I think this was filmed in the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which is a big gay pub in Vauxhall.
Support the miners.
So you're the only girl?
That's right. And the L in LGSM.
That is something the real Stephanie Chambers has said. I remember meetings where I was the only woman, and it felt as if I was the lesbian in Lesbian and Gays Support the Miners.
And don't look so bloody worried. It's not the first day of school.
So that's Sian James. The real Sian James was an MP for 10 years in the 2000s, and she's still around and still talks about LGSM.
I'm not disputing that.
All been so consistent.
Then why don't you just invite them? I'm sorry, but everyone's saying they don't have a problem. Good, they've raised the most money, so invite them.
And who the bloody hell are you?
Imelda Staunton's character is based on Hefina Headon, who died around the time they started filming.
I don't have a problem with what they are.
None of us do.
It's the men. Well, you bring a load of gays into a working men's club, you get trouble. I'm sorry.
So Sian James and Howell Francis talk about this first meeting, and they have slightly different accounts about it. Sian James remembers some homophobic jokes being said at the meeting. She specifically says jokes like, we'll all have to stand with our backs up against the wall. But Howell Francis says he doesn't remember anything like that.
No pushing, no community singing, and absolutely no back-chatting the driver.
So in reality, on that first trip, there were, I think, 3 buses with 28 people.
Every woman is a lesbian at heart. Every woman is a lesbian at heart. Every woman is a lesbian at heart, including Reggie Mom.
This is a real song that lesbians sang in the 1980s and that members of LGSM specifically remember. Got some of that brass band kicking in there, tugs at the heartstrings.
Look at the map. We should have turned left in that village.
How can that be a village that doesn't have any vowels?
So they really did get lost on their first trip, but they got lost much worse than this. They didn't get to the village until 1 in the morning.
I'm going to officiate you.
Okay.
You hold that and name here, please.
So he's based on Cliff Grist. We'll talk a little bit about him later on.
Listen, if 1 in 5 people is gay, then 1 in 5 minors must be too, right? So that's at least a fifth of you who's pleased to see us.
So that 1 in 5 minors must be gay, that is something Mark Ashton genuinely said. I think the story is that he was going to put it on a poster and then was persuaded not to. But yeah, that is a real quote from him. And they really did all sleep on Di Donovan's floor like sardines on that first night, because again, they got there at 1 in the morning, and so nobody else who was supposed to be taking them was up.
They're bringing them in from London, from Bristol, all over.
They're pulling the lads in for anything now.
Sian James says, nothing prepared you for the Met. The way the Metropolitan Police behave, nothing prepared you for that. Nothing that I'd done, all the demonstrations and marches I'd been on. I'd been to some sticky places, but nothing prepared you for the Met. Nothing.
Oi, if it wasn't for those people over there, you lot would still be in the nick.
What? He's right.
You make me sick. That's all I know, Di.
That's enough.
Physically sick.
Okay, so this is really important, and this is a big part of the film's message about genuinely how, practically, do you build solidarity between 2 groups so that you both benefit. And something I've noticed reading through accounts by members of the LGSM is that none of them report anything like this happening. None of them report any blatant, obvious homophobia, any queer bashing from members of the Welsh community. So when I read those, I was like, oh, they've just put this in the movie to heighten the tension. And then I read accounts from people in Wales, and their remembering of it is slightly different. They do remember some homophobic comments, but either they were all said behind LGSM members' backs and like the Welsh community made sure that they didn't hear it, or the LGSM members are being very polite and not mentioning when those things happen because they're not important because they would destroy solidarity, right? I think that's really fascinating. Like, what do you do if in that position. I think there's so much we can learn from LGSM, honestly. Okay, my camera kept overheating, so it's like 6 hours later. I'm doing it in the evening now. Mad Max Fury Road, filmed in the Namibian desert, but my camera can't handle London flats in summer.
What I was told about lesbians really did shock me. That can't be true, can it? You're all vegetarians.
Actually, Zoe and I are both vegans.
So that's true. Christine Powell from Wales said, they told me they were vegetarian, and I thought, you may be gay and I can handle that, but what the heck do I do with a vegetarian? Eventually I asked, do you eat egg and chips? And thankfully they did, because that's all I could manage. But also, this is another really important point of solidarity. So apparently on the drive down, they were talking about these are starving families. They just get their food parcels. They've not got any money in. And so if you're staying with a family and they give you corned beef for dinner, are you going to turn your nose up at it? Are you going to tell them, no, I can't have that? Because that might be all they've got. Especially in the 80s, man. If you're a vegetarian in the 80s, you had to work hard for it. So you weren't just a vegetarian because you felt like it. You were a vegetarian because you had strong convictions. You had to, because it was so bloody hard otherwise.
You live together like, husband and wife, but what I want to know is...
I know what you're going to say.
Which one does the house work?
That's sort of true. That is based on something that they said in the interviews. Ray Goodspeed from LGSM said, someone did ask one of the gay couples which one did the housework. How does that work? Who's the husband and who's the wife? It wasn't hostile, it was just curiosity. And then Di Donovan said, I've heard that some people said to them who's the wife and who's the husband. Well, if I'd heard someone say that, I'd have fucking clipped them round the ear.
Shame on you if you can't...
So strictly speaking, this didn't happen, but it is based on a real photo that was taken in the Working Men's Club in Wales of a whole group of them dancing and Jonathan Blake in the middle being like... So yeah, it is based on a real piece of historical documentation. I love the use of brass bands in the soundtrack. For anyone who grew up in a mining community, brass bands are often very closely linked with mining communities. They often have big brass band traditions. So they use a lot of them in the soundtrack. I think it's lovely.
Aren't you going to bring your mum?
How far? A long distance queer bashing.
So the real Stephanie Chambers, her mum's a lesbian. It's, just a little bit of fiction there.
Threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected.
This is a real advert that the government made in the 80s.
I just went back and rewatched the actual AIDS advert and oh my god, they did not mess about in the 80s. If they didn't want you to do something, they carved it onto a tombstone.
So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives.
Yes, that is John Hurt's voice, and yes, they're playing the Dies Irae in the background. If you don't know the Dies Irae, it's a medieval song that means death, and it goes na 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 na. Have a listen.
Virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman.
Also, if we are being picky, that advert won't be released for another 3 years in 1984.
Ah. No. He's a little nervous. Jonathan.
There's no need to be nervous, boy.
With a good Welsh name like that?
Where are you from, then?
Real, originally.
No. No way.
Listen here, see. We don't mind the gays and the lesbians, that's fine. But don't you dare be bringing people from North Wales down here.
From what I understand, that was also a real joke that was cracked at the time.
We need to start thinking in larger chunks of money because without it they're going to fail. It's as simple as that.
I'm sorry, but when are you going to address my question about a women's group?
Blind 70.
Stella, this is important.
I know, but this group has absolutely no democratic process.
What do you need a women's group for anyway?
Thee and me.
To address the women's issues.
23.
Singly and in a safe environment.
So the treatment of lesbians against pit closures is probably the most controversial part of how this film's been adapted. So the scriptwriter has given Stella very weak reasons for wanting to make a breakaway group, with the idea that you're going to understand that this is just factionalism, she's just sowing tension for no reason. And that is definitely the opinion of some members of LGSM. So for example, Dave Lewis says, "I think it was a mistake. There was no need for it. We were all engaged in a huge war, and I think that the war, support for the miners, was more important than how we as individuals might feel." Stephanie Chambers, who's fictionalised as Steph in the film, says, "Personally, I thought it was divisive. I thought the lesbians were being divisive, and I thought we needed as many people as possible in the group." But if you look at how the women who actually formed Lesbians Against Pit Closures talk about it, they do have good reasons that aren't very well explained by this character of Stella. If you read what people like Wendy Colden and Nicola Field say about Lesbians Against Pit Closures, the way they explain it makes a lot more sense. They say that because LGSM had so many blokes in it, the meetings could get quite shouty with everyone just yelling at each other. Not necessarily in a combative way, but in a way that could be off-putting, and they thought that they could probably get more people to join if there was a group that was just for women. So Nicola Field says, "And it was quite bullying, so that I saw men tearing into each other remorselessly on points of political theory at meetings. I could see that it was a very unforgiving environment, and you would have to be completely unaligned and rise above it to cope with being there. Because we met a lot of women in the clubs who wanted to support the miners but didn't want to work with men, we agreed to set up a separate lesbian club, and I knew where I was with that." Lesbians Against Pit Closures didn't break away entirely. They always carried on working with LGSM to support South Wales, but they also fundraised for a mine in Nottinghamshire. And some people in LGSM supported the new group. So, for example, Mike Jackson said, "To my mind, if we wanted to have a group of lesbians and gay men supporting the miners autonomously of other political organisations, I didn't see how we could complain that the lesbians wanted to form their own autonomous group to do the same. It was all the same principle." So yeah, there are some interviews with LGSM members who are pretty uncomfortable about how the lesbians group is made just to be the butt of this joke about Arthur Scargill, really?
I'm a woman, Mike, okay? I'm also a lesbian and a feminist.
Listen, love, I don't care if you're Arthur Scargill. Don't talk during the bingo.
Tickety-boo. 62.
Yeah, that's put her in her place. They were all talking during the bingo. Mark was talking about the bus.
1,000 midlofts grey are touched with all the radiance.
So the song Bread and Roses has been associated with socialist movements and the women's movement kind of since the 1930s, all over the world, really. It's been used in lots of different labour movements, so it is definitely not out of place here. And even though this conceit of having one person start off singing it and then everyone joining in these little designated groups is very artificial, it still makes the hairs on my arms stand up. So this bit is fictionalised. The real Gethin's mum is supportive. She's cool. They did ask her if she didn't mind them just making up a new Gethin's mum, and she said she was all right with it. So we're all good on that score. But yeah, this is fictionalised.
Jesus. Perverts support the pits. A gaggle of gays and lesbians has come out in favour of the miners' strike.
So that is fictionalised. The title for the Pits and Perverts concert didn't come from any one particular headline. It just comes from the general tone of newspaper coverage at the time.
I love you.
You owe me.
That is the real poster and the real t-shirts for the Pits and Perverts concert.
There are no gay artists on this label, I'm sorry.
They don't have to be gay, that's the point.
As far as I know, this idea of them going round record labels looking for acts is fictionalised. Mark Ashton just knew the lead singer of Bronski Beat. They were just mates.
Why should gay people like me support the miners? Because miners dig for coal, which produces power, which allows gay people like you to dance to Bananarama until 3 o'clock in the morning. Next question.
That's a kind of echo of something that Mark Ashton really said. Hang on, let me get the quote. It's quite illogical to say, well, I'm gay and I'm into defending the gay community, but I don't care about anything else. The miners dig coal, which creates fuel, which actually creates electricity. One of the reasons I support the miners is that they go down and do it. I wouldn't do it. I mean, would you go down a mine and work?
I've never met a pop star. I have. Max Boyce. He was playing Swansea Ground the year our Jane was born. What's funny about that?
Max Boyce mention.
We turned into a lay-by where she told me she loved me. So I give her my debenture, block A, row 3.
You've won our badge. Call, not dole. And when the time comes, you have my word on this. We will wear yours. Shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand.
Genuinely just got goosebumps. That happened on camera. Di Donovan did genuinely make a speech. The exact speech has not been recorded, but Di Donovan has said what he remembers saying. He says, I only have vague memories of my speech. I don't think I wrote it down. But what he gives it as is, you have worn our badge, coal not dole, and you know what harassment means, as we do. Now we will pin your badge on us. We will support you. It won't change overnight, but now 140,000 miners know that there are other causes and other problems. We know about blacks and gays and nuclear disarmament, and we will never be the same. The real-life Stephanie Chambers really did snog women from Delice. There were lesbian women in the Delice Valley who knew they were lesbians, but who weren't out. I danced with both men and women there. I remember snogging some of the women. In fact, it was more than a snog. This bringing the meeting forward thing is fictionalised. That's not something that really happened. Just to give a little bit of tension, I guess. A ticking clock for us to drive towards.
Courtesy of those people and their agenda.
They would have sent a cheque, in reality. But it's obviously way more dramatic to pour all the coins out onto the table.
There's bloody thousands here.
So the concert itself raised over £5,000. But it also raised a lot of awareness, so the support groups started getting more donations, and apparently they ended up with about 19,000, which was so much money that it was kind of too much for what they needed, so they ended up sending a lot of that money to other groups in Wales.
Lesbians and gays support the miners.
Never mind the miners. There's gay people dying every day. That's what you should be thinking about. Not the bloody miners.
Okay, this is something they talk about a lot in interviews and in the book. They talk about getting bad reactions from the gay community much more than they talk about getting homophobic reactions from the Welsh community. For example, Capital Gay published a letter to the editor that said, I must protest. Support the miners indeed. They should ask themselves how much support they would receive from the miners if the situation was reversed. As for spending money, whose money, on printouts for support to the miners, it could be spent on better, more needed causes such as our gay defences, our gay old and lonely, our AIDS victims. This is another letter. If ever there was an example of inadequate people trying to gain strength and support by latching on to another totally irrelevant cause, this must surely be it. Dave Lewis says, we did get into discussions and sometimes arguments with people. There were people who were antagonistic. They were of the view that why should we do this for the miners when they've done nothing for us? And there was also the view that we should be raising money for our own because there's people dying now. There was the whole AIDS thing. Where is best to focus your energy? And like how much arguing about where to focus your energy is worth it? Because whatever you think your community should be focusing on, it's definitely not arguments about what we should be focusing on, right? Like, nobody wants that.
I'm gay.
I know.
Out of everything in the movie, with the exception of the bit where he holds up the megaphone outside Gay's the Word, I would have pegged this as the most made up bit for a movie structure. But actually, this is real. The real life Cliff Grist had been in the closet his whole life, and he was in his 50s when LGSM came round. Brett Harron says he'd had some sort of gay life, but a very closeted one. He certainly hadn't felt able to come out. And then suddenly these 27 gay guys arrived from London. He was in his element. His eyes lit up when we got there.
What hell's this? New van. Courtesy of our gay friends down in London.
I'm not getting in that.
Then you'll have to stay here.
That's true. LGSM really did buy them a minibus.
Lesbian, are you, love? That's right. We're just off to Swansea now for a massive layers off.
This is based on something that really happened as well. Sean James says, you'd be going past someone and you'd wind the window down and he'd say, are you lesbians? And we'd say, yeah, are you coming with us? That's true, when they went back it really was with the full brass band. I just love how this mirrors the shots of the first Pride March, where he was also stood on the sidelines, but pretending that he wasn't interested. Ah, the parallels! Cinematic parallels! That is based on a real 1980s badge that you could get.
What should I tell the others? Nothing. It wasn't here.
This never happened. I was never here. If you ever hear those words in a historical piece of film, it means we made this bit up.
Back then, when they knew even less about this thing, they gave out numbers with each diagnosis. 1, 2, 3, and so on. I'm number 2.
So that is close to the truth and not quite. Jonathan Blake is L1 because he was the first person diagnosed at Middlesex Hospital. There was no nationwide numbering service.
I'm a wife and mother, love. My life goes back to normal now.
Well, it shouldn't. You've a first-class mind. You should do something.
So this is how Sean James tells it. She does talk about, oh, you know, I was just a mother and a wife, and I just made the kids their lunchboxes and vacuumed the curtains until LGSM came along. Like, that is how she tells it. But also, she was at Greenham Common. In 1981, there was a massive women's blockade of an RAF site at Greenham Common where they were storing nuclear weapons. And Sean James was there. She was in the encampment. She was like getting her stuff moved by the police. So she does have an activist background. And of course, I'm not the person to tell her how her life story went, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. The hands, the cinematic parallels.
Screw you, Thatcher, I'll fuck you.
I can see the appeal of both.
Of course, on the box art, she ends up saying neither screw you, Thatcher, nor fuck you, Thatcher. It simply says, no, Thatcher.
Will you please put that down? We have a very good relationship with our neighbours.
Mike! So that book in the window, I think it says Sarah lives with Mike and John. That's a reference to a real book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, which is about a girl who lives with her 2 dads and was notorious at the time. It was like slammed in the press as a pervert sex book that was being pushed on Britain's schools. And then it turned out it was not in a single British school. Like, no school library carried Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. I wonder if maybe they couldn't get the rights to show the book cover? Is that why they've changed it? I don't know anything about how you would... Surely you don't need to pay to show the cover of a book in the background. So this is being filmed in Victoria Park, but I'm guessing it's supposed to be depicting Hyde Park. Hang on, let me check. So I'm reading the programme for the 1985 Pride. It doesn't have a map. I just want a map. So there's no map, but it does verbally describe the route. So it would have started in Hyde Park. It goes along Piccadilly, down through Trafalgar Square, down the Strand and across Waterloo Bridge to Jubilee Gardens, like more or less where the London Eye is now.
If you insist on marching with your banner, you'll have to march at the back with the fringe groups.
Mate, we're LGSM, we fall alongside the miners.
Congratulations, but now it's time for a party. There's too many of you. What? You'll have to go to the front.
What's he mean too many?
It's on about.
I think he means them.
So this isn't quite how they explain it. Mike Jackson says that they were debating amongst themselves whether they should ask to be at the front, whether they should ask to lead the parade, and they decided that they wanted to go in the middle, which is where the Labour groups were. Then Mike Jackson goes on to say, and as they were assembling the lodge banner, the crowd just gathered around us and wouldn't move until eventually someone from the Pride Committee said, "You'll have to lead the march. There's just too many of you and we'll never get you out if you don't." So by default, we did lead the march that year.
Fernhill Lodge, Bardi Lodge, Blind Rock Lodge.
Oh, and the brass band comes in. God, those banners. Like, can I make a request for all activist groups? Can we get good banners back, please? Can we bring that back? We need to return to the good banners. I am going to nitpick the route, because now we know the route that the 1985 Pride March took. We know that they did not go down Whitehall, which is that road. And we know they didn't cross Westminster Bridge, they crossed at Waterloo Bridge. But having Big Ben in the background is so iconic. I can't fault them for that. You don't want to cross at Waterloo. I mean, you do want to cross at Waterloo Bridge. Like, Waterloo Bridge has the best views, but yeah, you wouldn't get the Houses of Parliament in the background like that.
Power in a union.
Ah! And you got the Welsh choir coming in. There's a massive tradition of choirs in Wales. Like, the stereotype is that all Welsh people are just really good at singing because they have this really strong choir tradition. And to fade that in to this song is really beautiful. This is the really important bit, right? After LGSM supported the miners turned round and supported lesbian and gay rights in return by pushing through gay rights onto the Labour Party's agenda. Obviously, because the Labour Party is the Labour Party, unions have a lot of power in it, and the issue of gay rights had been brought up before, but it had never been adopted as an official party plank until the 1980s, until after LGSM, when the National Mining Union, which is a really strong union, threw their support behind it. So that's the movie Pride from 2014. It is really accurate. I mean, there are some characters that are composites or that are fiction, and there's some fictionalized ramping up of tension that isn't there in real life. But a lot of it is really detailed, and that has to be because a lot of these people are still about and were advising on the film. Mike Jackson is still about, Jonathan Blake is still about, Sean James is still about, and the scriptwriters were able to draw on their experiences as well as the historical documents that are in the LGSM archive. I'm going to give the final words to Mike Jackson, who said in the book Pride, "They taught me the meaning of the word comradeship. I'd previously worked with lesbian and gay activists, and of course there was a sense of common cause with them, but that was nothing compared to the comradeship I got from working within the traditional strong communities in South Wales. We learned such a lot from them."
Oh, and I wrote a book. Sorry, did I not mention that? I wrote a book. It's called Mavericks, Life Stories and Lessons of History's Most Extraordinary Misfits. Each chapter tells the story of a person who had a truly unusual life. So if you're interested in queer history, you might be interested in the story of Le Chevalier d'Eon, who came out as a woman in middle age in the 18th century, or Radcliffe Hall, who went to court to defend her lesbian book in the 1920s and who communicated with dead spirits. Each chapter is like an entire one of these long videos, so it's like 24 videos in one concentrated burst. It's currently available in hardback and ebook formats. Other versions might become available at a later date depending on sales. My publisher hasn't decided yet. To those of you who've been asking about signed copies, if you can find me, I will sign it. But is it available in Country X? What I'd recommend is checking Country X's Amazon. If you can find it there, then yes. I've even had some very kind people ask where to buy it so that I get the most money. I get the same amount of money wherever you buy it, don't worry. There's enough things to be worried about in this life. But of course, I would recommend supporting your local bookshop, either directly or at bookshop.org. If you don't have a local bookshop, then I would recommend either Waterstones in the UK or Barnes & Noble in the US. Or of course, you can get it off Amazon, it's fine. Mavericks is available for pre-order now, and it's out on the 11th of February. I wrote a book!